Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Tuesday, the 27th of May, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We'll go ahead and jump into today's domestic sit rep, starting with this boost to nuclear development. Good morning, Robert. What's going on?
Good morning, Mike. So President Donald Trump issued 4 executive orders on Friday, and according to these orders, the intent is to boost U.S. nuclear power development and nuclear energy supply chains. And in these orders, he's directing the Department of Energy to approve the construction and operation of some advanced nuclear reactor technologies, which in this case includes small modular nuclear reactors. They also want to streamline advanced nuclear technology testing to allow more labs outside of the national laboratories to test these small modular reactors, and they also want to expand the domestic nuclear fuel supply chain. And they point out something that I think, have said multiple times is that U.S. power plants are majorly reliant on uranium fuel imports, and they're trying to reverse that. They're trying to reverse that import reliance.
Mhm. And this would be part of a larger plan. The Trump administration wants to boost U.S. electricity production by, I think, 100 gigawatts a year. And this is to reindustrialize the country. Yet another hurdle. Thanks for the update here, Robert. All right, let's move on briefly to this critical mineral fast track approval. What's going on?
This is coming from the Bureau of Land Management. They approved the Velvetwood uranium mine, which is just south of Moab, Utah. And this is under the BLM's new what they're saying is a 14-day fast track environmental review process. There are also 5 more projects that are being set up for this fast track environmental review in Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, Nevada, and North Carolina. And these are going to boost mining, domestic mining of copper, lithium, gold, and zinc, and some other critical minerals.
Mhm. All right, and then finally, let's moving down to the border here. There are these cartel scout bases, which I'm honestly shocked still exist, slash were allowed to exist for the previous 4 years under the last president here. But apparently, Customs and Border Patrol are finally, or Border Protection, are finally going to dismantle them. What does that entail?
So this is from Tucson Sector Chief Sean McGuffin, and he said that the CBP Special Operations Group that includes BORTAC, their agents are working in cooperation with Mexican officials, and they're raiding these cartel scout bases on both sides of the U.S. border. And he said they're aware of numerous cartel scout bases along the border, but currently most of that activity is predominantly on the Tohono O'odham Nation land, which straddles the U.S. And Mexican side of the border. And I think that makes sense because from what I've seen from law enforcement officials in congressional hearings over the last few years, that is the major area of activity is this Indian reservation land, because there's limited jurisdiction for local and state law enforcement. So it usually falls to either tribal police or the FBI in some cases. So that activity happens because there's not a significant threat of local and state law enforcement going against drug activities on these lands.
Mm-hmm. So I imagine these are probably more than hide sites, but they've got optics, binoculars, thermal. I'm sure they have all sorts of fancy whiz bang tools they're running out there. And this is probably just to track law enforcement presence for these coyotes, I'd imagine, Robert.
That's what it sounds like, but they've also McGuffin also said that in recent raids this year they've found body armor, weapons, and ammunition and stuff like that. So these are armed observation posts. And he did say that they're being very cautious about these raids, and planning them very carefully, because they are expecting to run into armed resistance in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is like a paramilitary threat. This is not just a simple criminal organization here. Quite literally paramilitary. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to our global sit rep. Good morning, Jared. Starting with Japan. What's coming out of there?
Good morning. So this is coming right from Japan's prime minister. He told his media that in the trade talks that they're continuing with the United States, he's going to offer icebreakers, which has been an enormous that's been an enormous point of focus for the United States, particularly as we work on expanding our presence in the Arctic. Additional ship repairs. Japan already does some, but they want to offer more and cooperate with the U.S. to help the U.S. build its own shipbuilding capacity. And all of this is in an effort to reduce U.S. tariffs on Japan. Mm-hmm. Now, the icebreakers are obviously the really important piece. Japan can produce a lot of ships, and the only other party that the U.S. has even considered is Europeans, but they also have shipbuilding crisis issues similar to us. So we could potentially get a lot more icebreakers a lot quicker, and they're very high quality. This is actually a picture of one.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Jared, just real quick. Don't we have an astoundingly low number of icebreakers in operation right now?
2 on paper, 1.5 in reality, because one caught fire and is still in the yard. I think it just left the yards like a month ago, but it caught fire last summer.
Okay.
And they're both 50 years old, so they're ancient.
Yeah. All right. Interesting. And then just briefly, so you run an icebreaker to break the ice, and that allows other ships to pass through in its wake, or is that how it works?
It can, but more importantly, it just allows a continuous presence up there. Like the ice is going to refreeze. So it actually does allow you to actually have a presence.
Okay. All right. Please continue.
All right. So Israel's national security minister led 2,000 Israelis into the Al-Aqsa Mosque over the weekend, which is an incredibly important mosque for the Palestinians and also generally for the Muslim world there. Mm-hmm. And the Turkish Foreign Ministry actually condemned this action, saying that it was an embodiment of the policies of genocide and forced displacement by Israel. They also said that Ben-Gvir raised the Israeli flag over there as a sign of conquest. This is just exacerbating the issues that are over there, and I'm worried that it's pointing toward a wider war. And staying in Israel, actually, the Justice Department returned Joseph Neumeyer, a U.S. citizen, to the U.S. on Sunday after arresting him in Tel Aviv. And he failed to set fire to the U.S. embassy there, which was his stated goal. And he failed only because he spit on one of the guards and caused a fight. So basically just a competency issue with him. But the police found Molotov cocktails with him. And prior to his trip on social media, he posted, "Join me as I burn down the embassy in Tel Aviv. Death to America, death to Americans, and F the West." So very clear intent there.
Sounds like not just a competency problem, but an IQ problem.
Might be related.
All right, Jared, this is interesting. Colombia, which is a major non-NATO U.S. ally, is set to join the New Development Bank, which is the new name for, or semi-new name for the BRICS Development Bank.
Yep.
What's going on?
Yes. So this decision was made at the highest levels of the Colombian government, but this was the Colombian ambassador to Armenia telling Russian media, "Hey, we are definitely doing this. We're joining the New Development Bank." And like you mentioned, Colombia's major non-NATO ally. They're also the latest Belt and Road Initiative signatory. They signed, I think it was earlier this month, and we covered that. And they also, keeping in mind that when all of the deportations started, Colombia was one of the ones that refused to take them initially before Trump put pressure on them and put it on there. I think all of this points toward Colombia is shifting away from being an ally of the United States, which if I remember right, they've got a leftist president, and I think when he was first elected,
Petro.
Yep, I think when he was first elected, you said that yes, this is a bad sign for relations with Colombia. It's been a while since that. And then moving over to Africa, this is coming from the commander of African Command for the United States, General Langley. He's telling our African allies there that they're going to be trained up to stand on their own generally. The AFRICOM is not going away. It's just they're going to downsize. Now, this is an issue because basically the U.S. military is focusing on protecting the homeland, shifting to the Pacific. That means getting out of Africa in a large degree. China and Russia are already there. They're already providing competing security training programs. But I think what's going to happen here is that the AFRICOM is probably going to just prioritize the most strategic African countries. So like Morocco controlling the Strait of Gibraltar, Egypt with Suez and Red Sea, and the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Africa for their cobalt mines and the burgeoning humanitarian crisis there, while getting allied nations such as France and Italy to actually come down and assist with security and try to keep China and Russia out as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. And let's go ahead and move on to some of our warning items for today. Actually, you know what? Let's start with this DIA assessment, Jared. If we could skip to that, since this is the highest profile item by far. You know, Robert, we've talked a lot about Sarah Adams. She's a former CIA analyst and targeter who has, for the past couple of years now, talked about a 9/11 2.0. This is, we're going to have more domestic terror attacks, catastrophic, worst that we've ever seen. These Islamic State and Al Qaeda and et cetera fighters and terrorists are already in this country. I think her group says there's something like 1,000 of them already in the United States that came over the southern border, and they want to kill 50 to 60,000 Americans. They're going to do it by targeting a stadium, some large venue with bombs and swarm, like Mumbai style swarm attacks. Pretty amazing stuff. To this point, we have not heard a lot from U.S. authorities on how likely this is, or if it's even possible. But Defense Intelligence Agency comes out recently, and they're saying, "Yeah, maybe. What's going on?"
So this is from the DIA's 2025 Worldwide Threat Assessment that was recently released, and they're saying that that ISIS will probably attempt a high-profile attack or high-profile attacks in the West over the next year. And they specifically say that ISIS and then ISIS affiliates in Afghanistan and then Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula pose the greatest threat to the United States. And there have been the most recent attack was that New Year's Day attack, ISIS-inspired attack in New Orleans, that was conducted by or committed by a U.S. citizen. And looking through, lists of attacks in both the U.S. and Europe, they are ISIS affiliate or ISIS-inspired rather than direct ISIS members conducting attacks. DIA did highlight in this assessment that something we pointed out a few times over the last over the term of Biden administration, that individuals believed to be associated with ISIS have transited the southern border, and at least 8 were arrested last year. And based on historical ISIS-inspired attacks, I think most likely we would see an attack involving a radicalized or self-radicalized U.S. citizens or legal residents, including people who could have come over in, refugee or asylum programs. Looking at, I think last week it was that shooting in Washington or in Virginia with that interpreter from Afghanistan who came over, I think in 2022 or 2023, who shot at police officers who pulled him over.
Yeah, that's not the same as an Islamic State attack. I mean, I think that was just an angry Afghan interpreter who's. I don't think that was a I don't think that was an ISIS-inspired attack. But what I'm saying is that I think that one of those types of programs could allow somebody who is affiliated with ISIS or Al Qaeda to come into the United States. So it's not impossible, I think, for an actual ISIS conducted attack, like Sarah Adams has said. I do think it's most likely to be something that we've seen, which is the base case is an ISIS-inspired attack by somebody who is either a U.S. citizen or in the United States legally, like the New Orleans attack, the San Bernardino shooting a few years ago. Yeah, man, I'll be honest. It is inconceivable to me that this would not be some illegal attack. And I understand most attacks are because people are over here on their visas or whatever. But I actually think there's some truth to this Sarah Adams claim. I mean, it is, I've gone through my heuristic for thinking through whether this is plausible or likely. Robert, it just seems extremely likely that there are, I don't know if there's 1,000. Is it feasible there are dozens of illegals in this country who come from Islamic terror groups? Yeah, it's at least feasible. Hundreds of them, yeah, feasible. So, this is something that I obviously can't independently verify, but I can't say that it is credible, but it is serious. And so I think it is also concerning that DIA is now coming out and saying that these ISIS attacks and they said these will probably happen in the next year.
Yeah, they said over the next year. And it's not just so they pointed out the spring arrests of those 8 individuals that have potential ISIS ties, but there have been, I think, starting in 2021, there was that former Border Patrol official who said that basically ICE and Border Patrol were ordered to release dozens of people who they thought might have ties to overseas terrorist groups into the U.S. interior. So it is in the dozens at least.
Yeah, the special interest. What do you call them? Special interest.
Special interest aliens.
Aliens. Yeah, yeah. DHS. They basically came right out and said, "Yeah, we released all these people," which is just absolutely astounding and criminal. Honestly, I think people should be held criminally liable if these individuals who were picked up and later released into the United States actually do end up carrying out these attacks. All right, Robert, anything else to add here?
No, I do think I do agree with you though that I think it is very possible that it will come from somebody who did come over the border illegally, because 1,000, like even assuming the 1,000 number, that's a drop in the bucket compared to at least 10 million illegal immigrants who came across the border starting in 2021. Just because of the programs that the Biden administration used, it wasn't just effectively allowing an open border, but also directly flying in hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants directly from DHS processing centers in Latin America.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and head back here to Politico, because last month, a senator from Michigan, Alyssa Slotkin, proposed forming a shadow cabinet, a quote unquote shadow cabinet, that could more quickly and authoritatively respond to the Trump administration and also counter this idea that the Democratic Party is weak and woke. And effectively, a shadow cabinet is the Democrats would name their counterparts to the existing Trump cabinet. And then you have kind of free range for the shadow Secretary of State to offer a policy alternative to the existing Secretary of State, or at least explain how Democrats would do it. So Slotkin has yet to announce her war plan. I think at some point in the near future, she was supposed to give a speech, or is supposed to give a speech outlining what her quote unquote war plan is against the Trump administration. But this morning, left-leaning media outlet Politico has an article with some proposed members, and I'll just go through a few. I'm not going to go through all of them, but Samantha Power as the shadow Secretary of State. And again, this is not Slotkin's shadow cabinet. This is just some guy at Politico with his opinion on who should be in the shadow cabinet, but it's very important for a few reasons, and I'll cover them below. Letitia James as the shadow Attorney General. I think she's the Attorney General over in New York. Mark Cuban as Secretary of Commerce, all right, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go through them all, but they are in this morning's report. So at best, this shadow cabinet would enable the Democratic Party to present an alternative policy in contrast to the existing cabinet members under the Trump administration. And so they would be able to frame an alternative policy agenda going into the midterms and the 2028 general election. At its most generous, this is maybe just a form of political warfare or politics as usual, maybe even an escalation of politics as usual. At its most dangerous, this is not the first time that someone in the Democrat Party has talked about a shadow cabinet or a shadow government. And this does sound very similar to the concept of a shadow government, which is an alternative political authority that prepares to replace an existing government following a revolution. So you basically have this government in waiting, and some people recognize them as the legitimate government, and then you topple the existing government, and then this new government in waiting, this new shadow government comes in and assumes that political and governing authority. So as Alyssa Slotkin's a former CIA intelligence analyst, she surely understands this concept. And so maybe this is purely a political attempt to get their message out to voters, but it may also be at its most dangerous, a partially developed government in waiting, or partially development, actual shadow government capable of assuming that political authority. If we do have a color revolution in this country, or there is some potential future collapse of the current administration due to political warfare, low intensity conflict, et cetera. So this is something I will be paying attention to. And I guess because we're seeing this Politico article come out, I guess she may be getting close to this decision or this speech. That's something I'll be looking out for. All right, let's move on to the next item here. And that is Seattle police arrested 23 protesters at a Christian family event in Seattle over the weekend. I thought this was interesting because this group, this Christian group, it's a tour, like 10 or 12 cities or something like that across the country. They stopped in Seattle and they wanted to hold their rally, this Christian family rally, in like at some park near Pike Place in Seattle. And the city council said they couldn't hold it there and that they had to hold it at Cal Anderson Park. Well, Cal Anderson Park is probably one of the most notorious places in the entire United States for Antifa activity. Almost every, I won't say almost every, many of the Antifa counter demonstrations, marches, riots, etc., start at Cal Anderson Park. So this looks like to me a pretty deliberate decision here by the Seattle City Council to push this Christian family rally. And it's like an anti-trans event, protect the children kind of thing. But looked like to me that the Seattle City Council wanted this Christian family event to be held in this pretty notorious Antifa meeting spot. At any rate, protesters pushed through metal fencing before 11 of these activists militants were arrested during a scuffle with police. An additional 12 were later arrested for assault and obstruction. And this seems like a pretty typical weekend in Seattle, considering what's happened here. But I thought this was interesting. According to local news, this counter demonstration was one of the first that has happened under the new rules that allow Seattle police to use less than lethal tools like tear gas, pepper spray, and these things called blast balls. And it's just I think it's like a little paintball that kind of explodes and it releases a chemical irritant. And so this rule was passed by the Seattle City Council to better enable police to control crowds and counter riots. And this plays into this thing that I started talking about in summer of last year, where these city councils and these mayors and these police chiefs were enabling law enforcement to do more to counter these riots. And at the time, I described it as essentially a counterinsurgency campaign. So this is another big data point for me when we're looking at these Antifa counter demonstrations, riots, etc. Law enforcement is no longer hands off. This is not 2020 anymore. These people, I don't know if these people who are arrested are actually going to be charged, but in Portland, I know for a fact they've been charged. Many of these Antifas who've been arrested have been criminally charged. And so, when we look at why is there a relative lack of Antifa activity and Antifa riots, and one of the reasons is because it's just a much riskier environment now because they are going to be arrested. They're probably not going to be released. They're probably going to be charged and could be facing prison sentences. So that is a much higher bar to involvement in criminal activity, at least. All right, and then let's go ahead and move on to the next item. Robert, we've been talking quite a bit about the Trump administration using emergency powers to stop the closure of fossil fuel power plants. We are otherwise running right into an energy crisis. And so DOE issued an emergency order, and this affects the Midwest grid. So what's going on?
Yeah, this is an order under the Federal Power Act. I think we covered this a couple of weeks ago. DOE issued a similar order to stabilize the grid on Puerto Rico, and now they're doing it for the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator grid. And they're ordering the utilities to keep the coal-fired J.H. Campbell power plant in West Olive, Michigan operating. And they're saying this is due to expected high summer power demand. They pointed out that this power plant was actually scheduled to shut down on the 31st of May, and that would have been 15 years before its scheduled design life. And I think the Trump administration is likely to use more of this DOE emergency orders under the Federal Power Act to avert these early coal-fired power plant retirements, because they are a threat to grid stability, especially during high demand seasons. And what's important about this type of emergency orders is that the Federal Power Act allows the Trump administration to stop these early coal power plant retirements in states with 100% clean energy mandates, because the Federal Power Act allows these orders to circumvent both environmental policies at the state level and federal level, and also these clean energy mandates, which in some of these areas have pushed fossil fuel power plants out in favor of renewable power, which does, I think, in recent examples, including in Europe, increase grid fragility significantly.
Mhm. Robert, probably 2+ years ago, we started seeing some dire warnings from these grid operators talking about this energy crisis that we're heading towards. And a lot of this, I think maybe most or all of this, is directly due to this Clean Power Plan 2.0, which was 1.0 was under Obama, 2.0 was under Biden. The Trump administration and the current energy department have obviously been reversing many of these policies here. Are we seeing this similar level of warning now from these grid operators? Is it still as dire as it was going to be 2 years ago?
I keep seeing, warnings from utility operators, state level officials about these power shortfalls. And I think what at the center of this was, you're right, it's the Clean Power Plan 2.0, but that is part of that sort of larger nudge strategy that started under the Obama administration. So they're not directly telling states that they have to shut down these power plants. It's just making the emissions regulations strict enough to make them unprofitable so that they sort of shut down on their own. And the Biden administration wouldn't have had to take blame for that. And I think that is still lagging as far as these power plants staying open. There's been multiple bills passed by the current Congress under the Congressional Review Act to try to reverse these policies. And I think the recovery is still going to lag behind, reversing those mandates. And then at the state level, there are still some states, while some, especially in the Northeast, have looked at reversing these 100% clean energy mandates or looking to nuclear. Many of them still do have mandates to go completely non-fossil fuel by as early as 2035. So we're still seeing some of these fossil fuel power plants scheduled to retire early because of those mandates. So there's still warnings coming out. I haven't seen any utilities or state level officials say that, congratulations, we solved it. But I think this is a major step toward, reversing that Biden and Obama era nudge to push these, especially coal power plants, out of business.
Mm-hmm. And then remind me, I know we've seen several reports come out from the FERC and the NERC about power shortfalls. Do you recall which regions were at highest risk? Because weren't there like 2 regions that were at extreme risk or something like that?
Yeah, it was the Northeast and I think actually the Southeast as well. And a lot of that was due to these retiring power plants. I think the latest NERC report from December of 2024 pointed out that they were expecting these grids to lose like 100 gigawatts in baseload power generation over the next couple of years. And that was a major factor in their assessment that these grids were in high risk.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I remember actually Tennessee, I guess it's due to power demand because so many people are moving to the greater Nashville area. Just weren't ready for it. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to the next item here. Jared, good morning. So China has declared a no-sail zone near North Korea. I guess this is similar to their claiming territory throughout the South China Sea.
It certainly seems that way. 2 of them should be gone by now. They were just for military exercises happening over the weekend, but nevertheless, they did do it inside of Korea's exclusive economic zone. So that's a violation of the agreement they have. They're supposed to stay on China's side of the line, but they did not. But you can see the little square down here is entirely in Korea's EEZ, and that one was not for a military exercise. It's just there with no stated reason. That's a significant violation of that agreement. Now, I think what's happening here is China is testing Korea's tolerances and worsening this maritime territorial dispute, which until very recently was there, but not really too much of a factor. But they're doing this at the same time that there's a looming war in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait and the Western Pacific. So the question has been, why are they doing all this? Why are they building these structures? Why are they running these drills? Well, I think what China's trying to do here is target all of the places that the U.S. has a military commitment such as South Korea, Philippines, Japan, Taiwan. We're not allied with Taiwan, but we are congressionally bound to provide military support to them. But I think that's to stretch out the U.S. military in the region, get it as thin as possible. However, what I think that's actually doing is alienating all of China's Pacific neighbors, and that's going to drive them to the United States for both security and trade, because China's also doing this as there are trade negotiations going on with Korea, Japan, and the entire ASEAN bloc. What that is really doing is solidifying that anti-China coalition, and I think that's going to pressure China. I don't think they're actually saying what they're doing here is coalescing that coalition, and then that's going to cause China to say, hey, we're being ganged up on. We need to be more aggressive. We need to be more assertive and actually press these even further. So I think this is not just generically a heightening of tensions or an escalation of it, but truly this is going to raise the stakes. They're going to start pushing further into solidifying their claims. And I think we will see much more in the Yellow Sea here between China and Korea around these semi-permanent steel structures that China's been building as well.
Mm-hmm. Last week, wasn't there were some media reports that the U.S. was trying to pull out some of its forces from South Korea or something like that?
Yes,
there were some claims.
Yeah, that came from the Wall Street Journal. The South Korean government immediately said, absolutely not. That's not even remotely in the talks. We're trying to figure out how to pay for it. And then U.S. Forces Korea came out over the weekend and said the exact same thing. So they're not trying to do a drawdown. And the drawdown they described would have just been kind of a tactical retreat anyways of sorts. Basically, it's moved them from Korea to Guam, so they're a little bit out of the line of fire and can provide support on a second wave. It wouldn't even be a total, de-armament. It was just,
I see,
replacing them.
So, okay. So where I'm going with this is, could this be an attempt by China to pressure the South Korean government to keep as many U.S. troops in South Korea as possible so that they don't get repositioned in Guam?
I think that's possible, but then you're also going to have to see. I think China, actually, as a good follow-on, that may cause China to try to get additional European and probably not African support. They don't really want them there. But if you can tie up more American troops in AFRICOM, as we covered earlier, then you can't downsize AFRICOM to switch over to the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
We could definitely see some pressure there. There aren't as many levers. Europe is probably the biggest one. There's some in the Middle East, but I don't think they have quite the leverage there. It doesn't seem like Iran's got the appetite for it.
All right. Thanks for that. And it's our last item of the day, so we'll go ahead and get to your questions. All right. We linked to that threat assessment report. Yes, of course. We'll put it over in the early warning chat in our library for everyone as well. So you can download it and read it yourself. You could also Google it. I'm sure you could find many places online to download it immediately. Regarding the German Chancellor's statement that the Western Alliance has lifted all range limits for arms sent to Ukraine, does that actually change the situation in Ukraine, or is it mostly bluster? I don't know. I saw this and my first thought was, I guess they're going to, some of the Western munitions that these NATO countries have provided Ukraine have had range limits so that they could not be used to attack deeper into Russia. And so if this actually does end up happening, if this is true, then it sounds like it would enable Ukraine to target deeper inside Russia. And so I would say that probably changes the situation somewhat, Ukraine's whole thing is to try to gain leverage, attack deeper into Russia. And they did this big Kursk invasion, and it's jostling for chips on the table. And so, I look at this and I say, fundamentally, it probably does not fundamentally change. It definitely does not fundamentally change the course of the war. But could Ukraine use attack? And here's the other thing. I think the Ukrainians have been on the assumption that the more attacks they they launch into Russia, the more Putin will be pressured into a ceasefire. And to date, that has not been the case. So I don't know if they need to do a key assumptions check or not, but we'll see. Putin does not seem to have been deterred in the least by Ukrainian attacks into Russia. It seems like he's been more determined as a result. Hope that answers your question. Why are thousands not believable? We've been asleep at the wheel. I'm not saying I disbelieve. Well, first of all, do I believe that there are dozens of Islamic terrorists in the United States? Yes, absolutely. I do believe that. Do I have direct evidence for it? No, but I have common sense. You know, is it feasible? Let's run through these factors. So listen, back in, I don't know, somewhere around 2008, I was in Iraq, and we were doing this thing on Jaish al-Mahdi, which is one of the Shia extremist groups over there, or at the time. And I was asked a question. I didn't have any. There was no analytic framework for me to answer this question, and so I started thinking through. Okay, well, this is very clearly an intelligence problem. So how do I solve this intelligence problem? And I came up with this mnemonic called FACT, and it's kind of a heuristic, or just a quick mental model or tool that you can use to attempt to assess whatever problem you're looking at. So FACT. So do I believe that there are dozens or hundreds or more Islamic terrorists inside the United States that came over the southern border? Okay. Well, is it feasible? Yes, it is absolutely feasible that could have happened. Is it apt? Is it something that we expect? Is it appropriate for there to be dozens or hundreds of Islamic terrorists inside the United States that have come over the unprotected southern border over the course of 4 years? Yeah, it's appropriate. They would definitely want to do that. Timely, or excuse me, consistent. Is it consistent with what we would expect them to do? Yes. Is it consistent with previous reports? Yeah, DHS said that they, under Biden, arrested and released some special interest aliens, which could be on the terror watch list. We know they've arrested people on the terror watch list before. So yes, it is absolutely consistent with what we've seen from reports. And then finally, timely, or, you know, why now? Is it timely for Islamic terrorists under 4 years of the unprotected border under Biden? Is it timely for them to have sent terrorists over the southern border? Yes, it's extremely timely. So, you know, I just look at that and I say, there is absolutely zero reason to doubt that they've sent terrorists over here. Now, again, I don't have evidence, but why are thousands? I don't believe thousands, but it's possible. But hundreds, easily. I can absolutely believe hundreds. All right, next question. What's changed in terms of criminal charges in Seattle? Leadership in the state is further left than they were in 2020. So what's changed now? Well, this isn't something that's not just happened in Seattle. It's also happened in Portland under the Portland Police Bureau Chief Bob Day out there. I think city leaders, they've gotten tired of the disruption. I think the Antifa riots it's obviously no longer politically convenient. It is a political liability. I think people are I think Americans are tired of this disruption, and I think we saw that in this last election here. And so I think this is more of a liability than an asset. I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons, which is not to say that it couldn't again one day be an asset rather than a liability, in which case we will probably see a return to 2020 like conditions. But honestly, I don't think we're there. Americans just do not have the appetite for political violence in general. So I think that's not only what's been changing in Seattle, but what has changed in many places. Isn't forming a shadow government treasonous? If Democrats go through this, could they be prosecuted? So here's the thing. This is, I wouldn't say it's necessarily insidious, but this is not something you just come out and you say, we have a shadow government that's going to replace the Trump administration after our color revolution. No, you do these things with some plausible deniability. You say, this is not a shadow government. This is a shadow cabinet, so that we are in our shadow cabinet members can offer policy alternatives to voters and explain why the current cabinet is wrong and what they're doing is wrong. And I think that's what this is. And you couch this in political messaging and there, and then it's not a shadow government or a shadow a shadow cabinet that could assume political authority after a color revolution. So I think you just couch it in politics, not necessarily governance. If one were cynical enough to think climate change is a lever more than legitimate concern, what are the potential objectives of its high-level proponents? Ben, I'm not exactly sure what this is in reference to. I guess maybe the Clean Power Plan or some of the energy stuff. Robert, do you have any ideas? You're on mute.
If it's more than a legitimate concern, if we're being cynical, the only thing I can see is just making energy more expensive, which in turn makes everything else more expensive, including travel. So you would have, less mass travel, more people effectively constrained within a geographical boundary of wherever they're born. But I think a lot of it has to do with, somebody pointed out in the comments, like what was written on the formerly existing Georgia Guidestones. A lot of that stuff, a lot of the people who are pushing, I think, things like the green energy revolution, a lot of it has to do with this perception that there is, at least in some areas, overpopulation, even though some of the same people also support, effectively open borders. So it's difficult to discern one singular motivation, because there's also a lot of money tied into this. A lot of the green energy companies that started these projects and benefited from things like the Clean Power Plan 2.0 made a lot of money during the Biden administration. So there's also a financial factor in this.
Yeah, I think if you want the green energy revolution, Americans do not want to pay higher energy prices. And so was it Rahm Emanuel says something about what was his quote on crisis? Never let a crisis go to waste. Isn't this the Hegelian dialectic anyway, or something like that? Like basically you cause the problem, you get people to demand the solution, and then you give them the solution that you wanted all along.
Yeah, and I think that's the basic premise behind the whole nudge strategy that started really heavily under the Obama administration, was exactly that. You don't just openly shut down fossil fuel power generation. You make these little adjustments here and there, like the Clean Power Plan. You make emissions restrictions more strict in a way that specifically targets the coal industry, and eventually that becomes a smaller percentage of the total power generation in the US. It becomes more expensive when it was at one time the cheapest energy source in the United States, and so people look to alternatives, and you can get media coverage saying that, well, wind and solar energy are cheaper now because coal energy has become much more expensive, and that's the solution. So yeah, part of it is that the Hegelian dialectic thing, the nudge strategy, but I think a major motivator is money. A lot of these green energy projects would not be financially feasible if coal remained as cheap as it was 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Yeah. Solyndra, and what's the energy one? What was that? Another Obama company that went under or something after?
Yeah, that was Solyndra, and they got a huge grant, and they were supposed to develop advanced solar cell wafers, and I think in Georgia, and it just became infeasible. It became insolvent because they got all this grant money, and then suddenly China was developing effectively the same product at a much cheaper price. And as we've come to find out over the last couple of years, basically not cheap. So there's this thing with Chinese manufacturing where people say, well, they're doing it cheaper and faster. Well, it's not actually cheaper. It's just heavily subsidized to the point that they're able to run these huge in a U.S. company, they would be out of business very quickly because they're not profitable. So they are running with effectively 100% government subsidy in most cases. And that's what happened to Solyndra, I think, is that the Chinese government wanted to take over the solar market. globally. So they subsidized solar development, and that ran that business out of business after receiving millions of dollars in federal money.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, fair enough. Point. Great points all around. Thanks for that, Robert. Next question. On the topic of China and South Korea, you guys made a map of China's influence countries and projected attempted influence. Jared, I think you've been running that map, updating every twice a year or something like that, every 6 months. Which way the countries are falling, whether they're pro China or pro United States.
Yep,
have you updated that recently?
I haven't. We last published it in January for the what's Trump administration heading into. It's about time to update it anyway, so I can re-update it and get it up this week.
All right. That would be fantastic. Thank you. All right. I think we're at the end of our questions. Everyone, thanks so much for watching. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.